The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 2. Each state party to the present covenant undertakes to respect and to ensure to all individuals. Now notice that. The subject or the player here is individuals. To all individuals within its territory and subject to its jurisdiction, the rights recognized in the present covenant, without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 3. The states, parties to the present covenant, undertake to ensure the equal right of men and women. So notice the subject or the player now. It's no longer individuals, it's men and women. To the enjoyment of all civil and political rights set forth in the present covenant. Black Laws, the 5th edition. Individual. As a noun, this term denotes a single person, as distinguished from a group or class, and also, very commonly, a private or natural person, as distinguished from a partnership, corporation, or association. But it is said that this restrictive signification is not necessarily inherent in the word, and that it may in proper cases include artificial persons. As an adjective, individual means pertaining or belonging to or characteristic of one single person, either in opposition to a firm, association, or corporation, or considered in his relation thereto. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article number 25. Every citizen. So now you see the subject or the player, the designation is now citizen. It's no longer individual, it's not men and women, but it's citizen. Every citizen shall have the right and the opportunity, without any of the distinctions mentioned in Article 2, and without unreasonable restrictions, a. to take part in the conduct of public affairs, directly or through freely chosen representatives, to vote and to be elected at genuine periodic elections, which shall be by universal and equal suffrage, and shall be held by secret ballot. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 16. Everyone shall have the right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 19. Everyone shall have the right to hold opinions without interference. Everyone shall have the right to freedom of expression. This right shall include freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers, either orally, in writing, or in print, in the form of art, or through any other media of his choice. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the Constitution Act of Canada, 1982, Article 2. Everyone has the following fundamental freedoms. So now notice the player, the designation, or the subject being brought forth here is everyone. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the Constitution Act of Canada, 1982, Article 3. Every citizen of Canada has the right to vote in an election of the members of the House of Commons. Now notice, the player, the designation, the subject being brought forth here is termed citizen. It's not everyone anymore, it's citizen. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, 1982, otherwise known as the Constitution Act of Canada, 1982, Article 6. Every citizen of Canada has the right to enter, remain in, and leave Canada. So you see, again, the subject or the player is termed citizen. It's not an everyone. The Constitution Act of Canada, 1982, once again, we're looking at Article 7. Now notice how it starts off. Everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, and the right not to be deprived thereof, except in accordance with the principles of fundamental justice. So the player, the subject, the one being brought forth here, the terminology being used, is everyone, no longer citizen. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, 1982, Article 11. Any person charged with an offense has the right. So now notice, the designation, the subject, the player is now person. It's not citizen, it's not everyone, it's person. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, 1982, Article 15. Every individual is equal before and under the law and has the right to the equal protection and equal benefit of the law without discrimination, and, in particular, without discrimination based on race, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, sex, age, or mental or physical disability. So here the player, once again, the designation is now individual. It's no longer citizen, it's not everyone, and it's not person. Looking at the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, understanding and knowing that this is part of the International Bill on Human Rights, and that Canada was a signatory to this covenant, and as such they are responsible, they are obligated to fulfill the rights and freedoms that are contained, that are enumerated in that covenant. Now when we look into that covenant and subsequently into the Charter of Rights and Freedoms here in Canada, the Constitution Act of Canada 1982, we find different subjects, different designations in law concerning who is being dealt with, concerning who is being spoken of. We find individuals, we find the terminology, the title, the designation, the subject, individual. We find the subject, the player, citizens. We find the subject or individual or player of everyone. We find the designation, the player, the subject of a person. And we also find the subject, if you will, or player, man and woman, human beings. Now each one of these designations, individuals, citizen, everyone, person, men and women, they all have duties and responsibilities, obligations and freedoms. And depending upon which one you are standing under is depending on what type of duty, responsibility, obligation, or freedom that you can exercise. We're looking at those designations in law, those players, those subjects. We're bringing attention to the word individual, the word person, and the word everyone. Now, these words, these expressions in law break down twofold. They can either mean a man or a human being, which is one and the same in law, or it can mean an artificial person, that legal person, the legal entity that's been created by law and given certain rights and duties of a human being. An entity that is real or imaginary that is given certain rights and freedoms of a human being. So when you see the word individual, person, or everyone in law, you have to then contend first with are they either dealing with an artificial person, that legal person, or are they dealing with or speaking about the human being, that man or woman? You have to find that out first. You have to decide that first by reading the context of law, what you're looking at. Once you figure that out, then you can see where it's applying to. Now, when you look at the designation of citizen, it only refers to the legal person. We know that because that citizen is a subject or a servant here in Canada of Her Majesty, and the fundamental human rights and freedoms that we have as a man or woman, as in everyone, has been removed from it, and it's being held in servitude to Her Majesty. That's why the Canadian citizen takes the citizenship oath of Canada and promises to pledge allegiance to Her Majesty, to be faithful to her, to obey her laws, and to follow her. So that places that citizen in servitude. So when we see in the law, when it says every citizen shall have the right to vote, it's talking about that legal person. Why doesn't it say everyone should have the right to vote? So we replace the word citizen, let's say, and we put the word everyone. Or we put the word person. Every person has the right to vote. You see, they couldn't do that. Because if they put the word everyone has the right to vote, then that would open it up, you see here, it would open it up for a man or a human being to be able to vote, as well as the artificial person, the legal person, the subject or servant of Her Majesty, the Canadian citizen. They can't do that because here in Canada, the only one who has the right to vote, who's been given that right, remember we talked about how depending on what designations you have, will depend on what obligations or duties or responsibilities or freedoms that you have. So the only one that's been given the right to vote here in Canada is that citizen. And if they were to use the term everyone has the right to vote, that would open up the way for a man to have a right to vote, a human being, let's say, who was in Canada, who was not a citizen of Her Majesty, and that would make no sense. So when the law wrote that down, they made specifically certain to use the word citizen, the designation of citizen, and not everyone. So not to give the man the right to say, well, he can vote. Now, unless you understand that that's what's transpiring in the law, you can read these laws and get lost in them. You can read them and not understand what's being brought forth. The important thing to remember as you begin your journey for freedom is that you have to see in what capacity are these designations being addressed. And the minute that you see, once you begin to understand your fundamental human rights and freedoms as expressed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Freedoms and the international covenants, once you begin to grasp the obligations that this state party, Canada, has towards you individually, then you can start to see that, okay, every time I see the word everyone, or person, or individual, and it's been stripped of a fundamental right that I find in the covenant, then that means that the one who's being addressed, the capacity that's being used right now, is that artificial person, that legal person. And that's how you're going to know. But if I find everyone, for example, let's say in Article 7 of the Constitution Act of Canada, where it says everyone has a fundamental right, and it talks about everyone has the right to life, liberty, and the security of the person. So everyone has a right to life and liberty. Well, we know that the subject or servant of Her Majesty, the Canadian citizen, doesn't have liberty. It's a created being, an artificial being on paper. It's a person that's been attached to the human being. And we understand that the everyone here, therefore, has to be able to express life, has to be able to express liberty, and it's referring only to the human being. To go deeper than that, even the justice system admits it. Just go search Canada and you'll see Article 7 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms talks about the fact that it only refers, these rights and freedoms are only for a human being and not for a corporation or an artificial person. But so, you see, by understanding that, then you would say, oh, that's an important verse for me in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, because it's referring only to a human being, only to a man and woman, and not to a legal person or an artificial entity. Now, when you find, for example, in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the word person, now we know person also opens up, excuse me, my board is getting dirty here, but we know the word person also opens up to either mean man or human being or an artificial person, the legal person. If you look in black laws or any legal dictionary, you'll see the definition of the word person is both. However, when you look into the Constitution Act of Canada and you see the designation of person and you judge what they're speaking about and you see how this person is being treated, you automatically understand and know that the person here is not the man. The person here is that legal person. That's who's being dealt with. Because you see what rights, what duties, what responsibilities, what obligations are trying to be placed upon that person, and you compare that with your fundamental human rights and freedoms that are in the International Covenant. And if you see that those fundamental rights and freedoms that were in the International Covenant are being stripped or removed from that person that's being spoken about, then you know that it's the artificial legal person. Because as a man or woman, they're not supposed to be able to limit you. When you look at the citizen here in Canada, we know that the citizen pledges an oath of allegiance to Her Majesty, and is being held in servitude to Her Majesty. That legal person, that citizen, when you designate yourself a citizen, you are a subject and a servant, or you are being designated a subject and a servant of Her Majesty. You have promised to obey her laws, and therefore she is your sovereign. She rules over you, so-called. That's what it is. When you're under that designation, you have capacity, you have duties, you have obligations, and you have rights. Now, when you look at the word everyone, and we look at it from being a point of view of a human being, of a man or a woman, that human being has freedom of association. and freedom from servitude. No one shall be held in servitude. So you see the different duties, different capacity. One, the citizen, has pledged an oath, is being held in servitude. The other one, the human being, is granted or has the right to stand from freedom from servitude and freedom to associate who they want to associate with. And that human being can take recognition as a person if they want. That human being can decide to do this and render themselves as a legal person, an artificial person. But it doesn't have an obligation. A man or a woman doesn't have an obligation to stand under this designation. What they do here in Canada is an implied consent, or they just give it to you. When you're born, if your parents were a Canadian citizen, born here second, third generations of Canadian citizen, you automatically are considered, or it's implied that you are a Canadian citizen. And as that Canadian citizen, you have now been rendered a subject and servant of Her Majesty. And you are first and foremost being treated from that capacity. And the way you are living your life, the way you are standing, produces the obligations that you have towards the government or towards this system, the rights that you can express, the duties that you have. So as example, we know that the human being, the everyone, has the right to recognition as a person. That's a fundamental human right that I have, that exists for me. I can take recognition as an artificial person if I choose so, if I decide to. However, that citizen can't do it. It's already in that capacity. That citizen is already that legal artificial being. So, different rights, different obligations. We know the citizen is a subject or servant of Her Majesty here in Canada. That citizen has pledged allegiance, given an oath, and promised to obey her, and therefore Her Majesty is its sovereign. That citizen has lost the capacity of liberty or freedom. I can't say as a Canadian citizen, I'm free, I'm in liberty. That makes no sense. Whether you've come from a secondary world or a third world country here to Canada and life is better for you, I'm glad for that. I'm thankful for that. Life can be very tough, but to understand that to say something like I am in liberty, I have freedom, it's not the case, because your citizenship, you as the designation of a citizen, are being held in servitude, are being held in bondage as a subject or servant to Her Majesty. That's why when you read the laws, for example, as I always state, it says, therefore Her Majesty enacts such and such laws. You read the Criminal Code of Canada, and the officers are acting on behalf of Her Majesty. So that citizen has lost its capacity of liberty and freedom. However, we find in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Article 7, it states everyone, the subject, the player, the designation, everyone, has the right to liberty. So we know, I've already shared with you guys, that everyone there is strictly a human being. And that human being has the right to liberty. So the human being still remains, or still has the capacity to exercise that liberty. Well, what liberty are we talking about? Just a prime example, or a quick example. When they try to force you to stay in servitude, or under the designation of citizen, and even if we go under the designation of simply a person, that legal person, that artificial person, you as a human being have a fundamental right and freedom that you can call upon, that you can stand under, that says you have the right to liberty. And therefore no one can force you to take designation or recognition as or in any of this. Now, do they want you to do this? No. Do they like that you understand this? No. Why? Because it's sort of against the commercial system. It's sort of against the democratic, well, I don't want to say democratic, but it's against the commercial system, and it causes them to lose power. It causes them to lose authority over you, and to not to be able to control your life when you understand what has transpired. First and foremost, apart from all this and all the laws that I've read tonight, if you ever get it in your heart just to sit back and think, well, why does someone else have the right to tell me what to do? Okay, I understand if I go out and I cause harm to somebody, physical harm or violence or something, then my neighbors would get together and stop me if there was no police force, for example, and say, hey, you can't do harm in the community. That I understand, those types of laws. But other types of laws, taxation and licenses and permits and so forth, why does somebody have the right to do this to my life? And what gave them the right to force me to abide by what they want in their system? It's again, it all comes down to implied consent. They've built a system around us where they're saying that, well, you've agreed and you've consented, and therefore we're going to throw it upon you, and you don't know any different, and you don't know the way of escape, for example, to say, or you don't know your fundamental human rights and freedoms, therefore you cannot stand against this system. So the system, bang, knocks you over, knocks you down, runs you on over. But as you begin to study and learn what's transpired in law, the different designations, again, citizen, everyone, human being, person, individual, and that these different designations afford whoever standing under them certain rights, certain freedoms, certain duties, certain obligations, certain responsibilities, and you can find a position or a place to stand under as that human being with your fundamental human rights and freedoms that frees you from being a subject and a servant.